All right, picture this with me. Somewhere deep beneath the sweeping, ever-shifting dunes of southern Libya, there is a massive, sprawling ancient city. And it's a city that the sand almost completely erased from our collective memory. In this explainer, we are going on a journey far, far beyond the familiar maps of the ancient world to uncover a totally forgotten civilization. This is the story of Garama, the capital of the Garamantes, the lost power of the Sahara. It's an epic tale of absolutely incredible engineering, staggering wealth, and a cinematic historical mystery that archaeologists are honestly only just beginning to unravel.
There's a saying, the Sahara does not keep cities, it keeps bones, wind, and silence. And to really grasp just how strange, how almost unbelievable this city was, we have to talk about the sheer, brutal desolation of where it sits. This region is known as the Fazan. Now, this isn't some lush little oasis sitting comfortably on the edge of the desert. No, it is plunged deep inside it, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the Mediterranean coast, totally surrounded by some of the most hostile, bone-dry terrain on Earth. There's no river here. There has literally never been a reliable river here. And yet, against all logic, a bustling city thrived here. And then it vanished so completely that for 1,000 years, the rest of the world completely forgot it ever existed. Okay, let's dive into this, because for centuries, the only trace that this civilization even existed lived in a handful of ancient texts that were really only half believed by the scholars reading them. Take the famous Greek historian Herodotus. He wrote this one line about a, quote, strange desert people who hunted in four-horse chariots. I mean, think about that image. For a very long time, that single, strange, almost mythical rumor was virtually all the outside world knew about them. Much later, a Roman general marched an army into the interior to punish them, and he came back with stories that just seemed way too wild to be true. A whole kingdom deep in the Sahara, thriving where absolutely nothing should survive? For nearly 2,000 years, most people just naturally assumed these stories were massive, massive exaggerations. But here's the thing, they were wrong. The Roman writers had painted this very specific, very dismissive picture of the Garamantes. They treated them like a nuisance on the empire's southern frontier. They just called them raiders, nomadic desert barbarians, constantly harassing the edges of proper civilization. But the truth, which actually lay buried under the sand for 2 millennia, completely shatters that Roman myth. The Garamantes were absolutely not some temporary nuisance camp. They were a highly advanced, incredibly sophisticated urban civilization that first rose up an astonishing 3,000 years ago. And the sheer scale of the wealth here? It was staggering. At its absolute peak, Garama was a sprawling, vibrant metropolis. Imagine actually walking its ancient streets. You look up and see these monumental stone temples standing right alongside massive mud brick neighborhoods packed with everyday families. The ruling class here was unbelievably wealthy. We've actually dug up imported Roman glass, fine ceramics, and gorgeous luxury jewelry. Because they controlled these massive, incredibly lucrative trade routes stretching all the way across the Sahara, they were moving gold, ivory, salt, and enslaved people north to Rome, and bringing wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods back south. Oh, and those rumors Herodotus wrote about? Yeah, they were totally real. We found ancient rock carvings showing Garamantian warriors on horseback and in chariots. This was a people radiating confidence, powerful enough to literally carve their legacy into stone. But this brings us to what I think is the absolute mind-bender of this whole story. It's an impossible contrast. How in the world do you support tens of thousands of people in a huge metropolis located in the driest desert on the planet with absolutely zero surface water? Because they weren't just barely surviving out there. They were actively farming wheat, barley, grapes, and figs. They built a thriving agricultural economy in a landscape that honestly looks like the surface of Mars. It shouldn't have been possible. And honestly, that right there is exactly why, for so long, no one believed it had actually happened at all. Well, the secret to their survival is just awe-inspiring. Underneath the city, and stretching for miles and miles out into the desert beyond it, archaeologists discovered something breathtaking. They mapped out over 500 underground irrigation tunnels. It was a vast, completely hidden hydraulic system. And keep in mind, there's no modern machinery here. Every single one of these hundreds of tunnels was carved out entirely by hand.
Okay, so how did they actually do it? To pull off this engineering marvel, workers used nothing but simple hand tools and a truly extraordinary understanding of engineering. First, they would dig these deep, vertical shafts straight down into the searing earth just to reach the underground water. Then, from down there, they would excavate horizontal tunnels with a perfectly calculated, very gentle downward slope. Those vertical shafts allow the workers to climb down, clear out the rock and sand, maintain the flow, and seamlessly channel that water over miles and miles right to their desert fields. They literally transformed patches of the driest desert on Earth into a lush breadbasket.
But wait a minute, where was this water even coming from if there was no river, right? Well, that is the catch. This wasn't renewable rainwater. The Garamantes were tapping into something we call fossil water. This was water that had been trapped deep beneath the desert floor since a much, much wetter climate existed there tens of thousands of years earlier. It had essentially been sealed underground since the very last time heavy rains fell on the Sahara. Section title, When the Water Vanished. So the crucial point we really need to understand here is what happens when a non-renewable water supply starts to run out, forcing a civilization to desperately dig deeper and deeper to chase a rapidly retreating water table. The collapse of Garama, which happened sometime between the 6th and 8th centuries, was really a compounding tragedy. It was a perfect storm. Some archaeologists point directly to the slow, agonizing exhaustion of that fossil water. I mean, once it was gone, nothing was going to refill it. The physical cost of maintaining that failing system would have crushed them. But the wider world was changing too. Rome's mighty power up in North Africa was crumbling, which meant the incredibly lucrative trade networks that made Garama so rich in the first place were totally collapsing. Trade routes shifted. New political powers rose on the coast. So it was likely this inseparable combination of environmental disaster and political collapse arriving at the exact same time, each making the other worse. Eventually, the monumental buildings fell into disrepair, the population shrank, and the desert dunes slowly, inevitably, moved right back in. And then, for 13 centuries, the outside world forgot Garama entirely. Fast forward to the 19th century, and European travelers passing through started noting these strange, unnatural-looking mounds near a settlement called Germa, but they really had no framework for what they were looking at. It actually wasn't until the 1960s that a British archaeologist named Charles Daniels began real painstaking excavation there, finally proving that a genuine urban civilization once stood on that spot. Sadly, he died before publishing his full findings, so the ruins just sat waiting again. That is, until a modern tool changed absolutely everything. This is where it gets really cool. Decades later, archaeologist David Mattingly and a brand new team took up the mantle using something Daniels never had access to: high-resolution satellite imagery originally taken for oil exploration. From up in orbit, patterns that were completely invisible to someone standing on the ground suddenly popped right out. They found the faint outlines of walls, massive ancient field systems, and heavily fortified settlements. Guys, this wasn't just one lost city. They mapped an entire lost landscape, over 100 fortified towns and villages completely hidden in plain sight right beneath the sand. It was an empire vastly larger than anyone had ever assumed. As we look back at the incredible rise and the heartbreaking fall of the Garamantes, it really leaves us with a deeply unsettling modern question. What happens when a civilization outgrows its only resource? Historians bring this point up very carefully because, let's face it, it's a mirror held right up to our own world today. The Garamantes thrived for centuries by drawing down a vital resource that could never, ever be replaced. And then, it simply ran out. Today, the wind still moves sand endlessly across the half-buried temple stones of Garama. But if you look from above, those ancient tunnel shafts are still visible. They run in these long, dark, haunting lines across the desert floor, looking quite literally like stitches in the earth. They mark a place where a brilliant, unbelievably resilient people once fought the mighty Sahara, and for a very, very long time, they won. But the desert didn't destroy them overnight. It simply outlasted them. And then, it kept their secret.